Donald Trump was asked the question that he cannot answer today by White House reporter Jeff Mason. It was the best question a reporter has been able to ask this president of the United States in a very long time. And the answer to this question is the very heart of the president's defense against impeachment, if he has an answer to this question. And as of tonight, the president has no answer, which means the president has no defense. And that is why most Republicans in Congress are not trying to defend what the president said in his phone call with the president of Ukraine. Here is the instantly historic moment when Jeff Mason exposed to the world that the emperor has no defense.
Mr. President, can you just make clear right here, what do you or what did you want President Zelensky to do with regard to Joe and Hunter Biden?
If you look at what he said, okay, and he brought it up, I think he brought up the name Rudy Giuliani. What I want is the following, and I've said this loud and clear. We have our ambassadors here. We have Mike Pence here. Why are we the only ones that give the big money to the Ukraine? We give money to Ukraine, and it's bothered me from day one, and you have plenty of people just here. I say, how come it's always the United States that gets ripped?
And then he kept going on without ever saying the answer, without ever saying what he wanted the president of Ukraine to do with regard to Joe and Hunter Biden, as the question asked. The president ran away from that question and used as many words as he possibly could in running away from that question. And Jeff Mason stood his ground and kept asking the question that Donald Trump could not answer.
What about Mr. Biden? What did you want about Biden? What did you want him to look into on Biden?
Look, Biden and his son are stone cold crooked, and you know it. His son walks out with millions of dollars. The kid knows nothing. You know it, and so do we. Go ahead, ask a question.
The question, sir, was what did you want President Zelensky to do about Vice President Biden and his son Hunter?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, it was just a follow-up of what I just asked you, sir.
Listen, you ready? We have the president of Finland. Ask him a question.
So when Donald Trump is asked the central question about his defense, his answer is, are you talking to me? His answer is, ask the president of Finland a question. Answers like that are going to get the president of the United States impeached in the House of Representatives. And answers like that don't give Republicans any way to defend Donald Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine, in which he clearly, openly solicited Ukraine's help in his reelection campaign by trying to get Ukraine to slander Joe Biden and his family. Washington has just gone through 24 hours of intense mystery, followed by dumbfounded confusion, followed by the revelation that the madness of Rudy Giuliani is driving the Trump administration mad. Last night at this hour, we were reporting that the Inspector General of the State Department had asked for an urgent meeting with several House and Senate committees today, a meeting that the Inspector General knew would be primarily a meeting of the committee staff because the Congress is in recess and most of the members of the committees are not in Washington. Congressman Jamie Raskin is a member of a couple of the committees that were invited to that meeting today, which he attended. He will join us in a moment with his reaction to the news tonight that the very strange package of documents that he saw today, that the Inspector General brought to the Congress today, originated with Rudy Giuliani. The Inspector General revealed that the counsel to the Secretary of State had passed along to him a strange package addressed to the Secretary of State in calligraphy with the return address of the White House. But it was in an envelope that did not look like an official White House envelope. Tonight, three chairs of the committees involved, Adam Schiff, Eliot Engel, Elijah Cummings, released a statement saying, today, the State Department Inspector General provided an unclassified briefing and documents to House and Senate committees. The Inspector General believes this matter is urgent in light of the complaint filed by a whistleblower regarding the president's call in which he pressed the Ukrainian president to smear President Trump's domestic political rival. The briefing and documents raised troubling questions about apparent efforts inside and outside the Trump administration to target specific officials. And the statement by the chairman went on to say that it appears as if this document may have been something that was provided by, as they use the phrase, the president's agent, Rudy Giuliani. Now, they don't say that in so many words, but sticking Rudy Giuliani's name in that document at that point was clearly done for a very, very specific reason. And tonight, we now discover that the chairman's mention of Rudy Giuliani might have been because they suspected he had a hand in this. Rudy Giuliani confessed to CNN tonight, telling CNN that the documents originated with him. Giuliani said he received a phone call shortly thereafter from Pompeo, who told him he would be referring the documents for investigation. They told me they were going to investigate it, Giuliani told CNN. Also tonight, the Washington Post is reporting Rudolph W. Giuliani in recent months has consulted several times with Paul Manafort through the federal prisoner's lawyer in pursuit of information that would bolster his theory that the real story of 2016 is not Russian interference to elect Trump, but Ukrainian efforts to support Hillary Clinton. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.